Hey, glad we could sit down and chat about this. We both call ourselves accelerationists, but we mean pretty different things by it. I'm coming from the left-accelerationist side, looking to push beyond capitalism toward a more equal society. You, on the other hand, lean right-accelerationist, embracing the idea of accelerating capitalism itself. It'll be interesting to see which approach we think is superior, or at least hash out the pros and cons.
Yeah, for sure. It's funny, we both agree that society is moving faster due to technology and other forces, and we both say let's accelerate things. But we have different endgames. I'm more about letting capitalism and tech run their course, even if it's a wild ride. You're more about steering that acceleration toward a specific political goal. So, let's compare notes on these approaches in a chill, open-minded way.
Let's start with how we see capitalism itself. As a left-accelerationist, I see capitalism as something that has historically driven huge technological progress, but it's also a system full of inequality and exploitation. In my view, capitalism isn't an end state we worship. It's more like a rocket booster that we might use to reach a post-capitalist future. We want to accelerate beyond capitalism, like use its technological momentum to create a new system that's more egalitarian. Even Marx had this idea that capitalism revolutionizes society but also creates its own gravediggers. Mark Fisher, one of the thinkers on our side, said, Marxism is nothing if it is not accelerationist, meaning that the left should embrace the drive of capitalism to push through to something better. So, we're not simply anti-tech or trying to go back to small-scale economies. We actually want to push forward, just in a way that benefits everyone, not just a few.
I hear you. From the right-accelerationist angle, we kind of take the opposite stance. We think capitalism itself is the engine of acceleration, and we're inclined to floor that gas pedal rather than hit the brakes. In fact, Nick Land, you knew I'd bring him up sooner or later, described capitalism as a positive feedback circuit in a runaway process. I love that description because it captures how markets, competition, and automation drive each other forward at an ever faster pace. Land even argued that capitalism transforms or revolutionizes itself faster than any planned revolution could. So from my perspective, why try to escape capitalism, if capitalism is what's generating the speed and innovation in the first place? I see it as the fuel that makes acceleration possible. The way I see it, if you really want things to change quickly, new tech, new social arrangements, whatever, letting capitalism off the leash is the way to go. Creative destruction might be messy, but it's how we get radical change. Sure, it's destructive in parts, old industries die, jobs get lost, etc., but it's also wildly productive in terms of innovation. That destructive side is, as weird as it sounds, part of the creation process.
Those are fair concerns. It's definitely a balance we try to strike. We know we can't just wish away the market's efficiency. Left-accelerationists don't propose shutting down markets overnight or anything. Rather, we talk about guiding or intervening in the process, kind of like steering a speeding car instead of jumping out of it. We might disagree on how separable tech is from capitalism, but we figure that at some point, accelerating further requires breaking the limits of capitalism. I mean, even you might agree that capitalism can run into internal barriers. Like, it innovates like crazy, but can also cause crises or stagnation when profits dry up. Actually, some of our folks, Nisek and Williams, argued that in recent decades, capitalism has stagnated in some ways and isn't living up to its innovative potential anymore. They felt neoliberal capitalism was kind of slowing down tech progress by focusing on short-term gains. So ironically, sticking purely with capitalism might not maximize acceleration in the long run if the system gets stuck in a rut of protecting old interests. That's another reason we think a shift to a new system could revitalize progress. But let's talk more concretely about tech and automation, since those are the big drivers here.
One thing we both are fascinated by is automation and high technology, right? I mean, accelerationism, left or right, often comes down to what you do with things like AI, robotics, algorithms, etc. From my vantage point, capitalism naturally pushes automation because replacing human labor with machines increases efficiency and profits. We're already seeing that. Companies invest in AI to automate warehouse work, driving trucks, even writing code. The accelerationist part is to just let this process rip through society. It can be disruptive, but it's how we leap forward. There's a belief on my side that if you accelerate tech under capitalism, you eventually reach a kind of breakpoint where so much is automated and decentralized that the old structures can't hold on. Some even say that this could empower individuals, like how the internet or cryptocurrency decentralize power. Nick Land suggested that the general direction of techno-capitalist change is toward decentralization. So, tech might ironically create new forms of freedom by routing around old hierarchies, all driven by market forces. We kind of trust the emergent process. Millions of actors in a market, each pushing for faster, better tech, ends up creating an intelligence or system beyond any one group's control.
We definitely have common ground in seeing automation as a game changer. Where we differ is in how we respond to it. Left-accelerationists say, great. Let's use automation to free people from toil. The ideal vision is something along the lines of, say, fully automated luxury communism. It's a cheeky term, but it captures the idea of an automated economy that provides abundance for everyone, not just profits for a few. In more concrete terms, Cernisek and Williams, in their book Inventing the Future, argued for massively accelerating automation, reducing the working week, and implementing a universal basic income so that productivity gains benefit society. Automation could liberate humans from boring jobs, if managed right. But here's the catch. We don't think the free market by itself will ensure that the benefits of automation are shared. If left totally unchecked, automation under capitalism might concentrate wealth even more, since the owners of robots get all the gains. You could end up with like a tiny elite owning AI, and everyone else unemployed, or in precarious gigs, basically a cyberpunk dystopia. So we argue for political measures, like UBI, or maybe even eventually commons-based ownership of tech, to make sure automation leads to widespread prosperity. Technology is not neutral in who it serves. We want to democratize it. Use planning and policy to make tech work for the many.
I agree that tech can displace workers and concentrate wealth. That's already happening. My angle is that trying to pre-distribute everything, like enforcing UBI or public ownership too soon, could backfire by removing incentives for innovation. I mean, if you tell companies we're going to tax the heck out of your robot gains to fund UBI, some might slow down investment or find loopholes. The right-accelerationist guess is that if you push automation far enough, society will have to adapt, maybe even with things like UBI, but it'll be kind of an organic, possibly chaotic adaptation rather than a neatly planned one. Like when enough people are unemployed because of automation, maybe there'll be political pressure for basic income anyway. Or maybe new industries will pop up that we can't imagine yet. It's a bit uncertain, I'll admit. We kind of place faith in the self-correcting aspect of the system, though that might seem naive to you. Also, you mentioned decentralizing tech. I find that exciting. For example, blockchain tech came from a pretty anti-establishment, market-driven place, and could challenge central banks or big gatekeepers. That's the sort of unplanned outcome I think can happen when you just let tech develop freely.
Decentralization is a double-edged sword. It can empower individuals, but without guidance, it can also create new inequalities or chaos. Look at cryptocurrency. It created new wealth for some, but also a lot of scams and instability. We left-accelerationists aren't against decentralization per se. We actually like the idea of distributed networks, but we'd want social ownership of those networks, or at least some public interest oversight. It circles back to values. Tech doesn't automatically create a good society. It depends on how it's used. You brought up that maybe if things get bad, political pressure will force adaptations like UBI. Possibly, yes. But waiting for crisis-driven solutions is risky. It can get ugly in the interim. Think massive unemployment riots or something. Our approach is more proactive. We already see where this is going, so why not start implementing policies to cushion the transition and guide it? Basically, we'd like to avoid the scenario where technology outpaces our social systems so much that society kind of breaks down while we scramble to fix it. We want a smoother political transformation to a high-tech future.
I get the intention, it's noble. But the tension here is between planning and spontaneity. Acceleration by its nature is kind of wild. The right ACC camp is more willing to embrace the wildness, even if it's scary. There's a trust in emergent order, like let millions of innovations, experiments, even failures happen, and something new and efficient will emerge out of the chaos. The left ACC camp puts more trust in guided order, using human planning to direct the outcome. History has examples that worry me though. Big attempts at central planning, even well-meaning ones, sometimes couldn't keep up with complexity, and stalled technological progress. The Soviet Union comes to mind. They excelled in some tech like space and military, but fell behind in others like consumer tech. I know you're not advocating old-school command economy, but even so, anytime we talk about collectively steering the future, I wonder if that steering might actually slow the vehicle down.
That caution is healthy. We definitely don't want to kill the golden goose of innovation with bureaucracy or something. Our thinking nowadays isn't about strict top-down planning of everything, but more about strategic direction. Think of it like setting the destination and some guardrails, but not necessarily detailing every step of the route. We can use tools of capitalism, markets, incentives in service of social goals. For instance, governments could heavily fund research in green tech or AI for the public good, or set regulations that prevent monopolies so that innovation stays competitive and widespread. In a sense, it's still using market dynamics, but with an eye on the end game of equality and sustainability. We talk about projects like Chile's old project Cybersyn as an inspiration. That was an attempt to use computers to help manage the economy democratically. It showed some potential of tech-assisted planning. So maybe future tech, like AI for governance, could make guiding the economy easier than it was in the past. Ideally, we want the best of both worlds, the dynamism of capitalism's innovation, and a deliberate social guidance to make sure it ends well for humanity.
Cool, and that balance is tricky. But I see where you're coming from. It's almost like a high-tech public steering wheel on the engine of capitalism. Whether that can work without the engine shaking it off is an open question. Maybe now's a good time to pivot into how each of us imagines the future, or the big picture political change that comes from our approach, since we've touched on it a bit.
Good idea. So politically, left-accelerationists are basically futurist leftists. We want a radical transformation of society, but not in the traditional slow reformist way. We're not satisfied with just tinkering around the edges. We think technology and accelerating change can be harnessed to create a post-capitalist society. The vision is something like a highly automated economy where work is largely optional, resources are abundant or at least efficiently allocated, and people have the freedom to pursue what they want: art, study, leisure, etc. Because material scarcity is reduced. To get there, we talk about building new institutions and political movements. There was the #Accelerate manifesto in 2013 by Alex Williams and Nick Chernisek that basically called out the traditional left for lacking imagination and being stuck in reactive politics. They urged the left to rekindle the grand vision of the future, like back in the 20th century when people dreamed of space travel, full automation, etc., which has somewhat faded under neoliberalism. Politically, this might mean a movement that campaigns for things like universal basic income, shorter work weeks, massive public tech investment, maybe even new forms of democratic planning using technology. It's not about a violent revolution in the classic sense. It's more about outsmarting and outplanning the status quo. They even suggest using the existing infrastructure, corporations, networks, etc., as a launchpad to something new. So, to sum up, the left-accelerationist political project is transformative but tries to be strategic, sort of a revolution through the tools of high-tech and collective action. It's optimistic in that we believe we can deliberately create a better future if we organize and use tech right.
Meanwhile, the right-accelerationist political vision is a bit less planned and a bit more go with the flow, maybe even apocalyptic to some ears. Honestly, some on my side aren't even pushing a specific political program. They're more like observers cheering on the breakdown of old systems. Nick Land, there he is again, painted this crazy picture of a technological singularity emerging. He wrote about a scenario where a techno-capital explosion happens. He even speculated about it kicking off in a place like China, and the old powers like Western democratic states struggle, and ultimately collapse in the face of it. In his vision, new forms of society rise out of the ashes. Maybe even post-human forms of intelligence. It's edgy stuff. He literally suggested that accelerating capitalism and technology will eventually lead to humans merging with machines or being replaced by them. Nothing human makes it out of the near future, as he provocatively put it. Now, not every right-accelerationist is as extreme as Land, but we do generally think that political transformation might come as a result of crises or meltdowns triggered by runaway tech capitalism, rather than through a pre-planned movement. It's a bit like expecting a natural evolution or even a rupture. As technology advances, society will either adapt or break. Either way, something new emerges. Some of us are okay with even radical outcomes, like AI becoming a major decision maker, or society reordering in completely novel ways. For example, autonomous cities, corporate governance models, who knows? There's even a wing influenced by Land's later ideas, the whole Dark Enlightenment thing, that flirts with the notion of non-democratic forms of government being more efficient for accelerating progress, like city-states run by CEOs or AI, instead of messy democratic slowdowns. I have to admit, that's a pretty controversial aspect. It's where accelerationism on the right can get borderline dystopian, or at least anti-egalitarian.
I'm glad you brought that up, because from my side, that's one of the scariest parts of right-accelerationism. The idea of just letting things break down, and maybe even endorsing authoritarian or oligarchic structures if they accelerate growth. Yikes. Nick Land infamously praised some authoritarian capitalism models, like he spoke favorably of China's rapid development, and even admired figures like Lee Kuan Yew, calling him an autocratic enabler of freedom. That kind of thinking sets off alarm bells for leftists, for obvious reasons. We don't think freedom should be handed down by autocrats, and we definitely value democracy and equality, even if those sometimes do slow things down. So a big weakness I see in right-accelerationism is that it can justify extreme inequality or anti-democratic measures in the name of the greater acceleration. It's like humanity could become collateral damage to this process of rushing toward whatever endpoint, maybe a super AI overlord or something. It raises ethical questions. Is acceleration a good thing if we, the people, have no say and many of us suffer during the transition? What's the point of an uber-tech future if it doesn't include human flourishing?
These are valid concerns, and to be honest, it's something even I wrestle with in theory. Right-Accelerationism can absolutely come off as cold or inhuman. There's a kind of dark joke that right-ACC folks are rooting for the machines or the markets more than for people. I personally do care about human well-being, but I just have this conviction that trying to hold back the tidal wave of change in the name of safety might actually make things worse, or that it's futile. It's like the wave is coming whether we like it or not. One could argue, and land often does, that democratic systems, by prioritizing immediate human comfort and consensus, slow down the very changes that could ultimately advance humanity, or whatever comes after humanity. But as you point out, the flip side is you might undermine the very notion of humanity or freedom that we care about. So it's a bit of a philosophical wager. Do you risk everything for the chance at a radically advanced future? Or do you try to guide the process to save as many as possible en route?
Right. It comes down to what you value and how much risk you're willing to take with society. Left-accelerationists are more risk-averse about social collapse. We'd rather not roll the dice on an uncontrolled future, because history has some nasty examples of breakdowns. We'd prefer a transition where people are empowered and actively shaping the future, not just swept along by it. Our weakness, I'll admit, is that this requires a lot of coordination and political will. We're betting on being able to rally people around a positive vision of the future. Stuff like, hey, we could have a post-work society of abundance, let's make it happen. That's not easy. Many on the left are still skeptical of anything that sounds like glorifying capitalism or big tech. For good reasons sometimes. Even among the public, if you start talking about AI and automation, a lot of folks just fear it rather than see the utopian possibilities. So our challenge is convincing people that this high-tech future can be their friend and not just a tool of billionaires. We also have to actually come up with feasible policies and get political power to implement them. No small feat. I mean, we saw movements like Occupy Wall Street flame out without a clear plan. That's why writers like Sarnaisek and Williams were saying the left needs a concrete project, not just protests. So yeah, we have our work cut out for us. If we fail to galvanize a movement, then your scenario might just happen by default.
And from my side, the weakness is indeed that we might unleash forces we can't control, and that could get very dark. There's also the moral question. Even if a runaway acceleration leads to some super advanced AI utopia, or whatever in 50 years, the path to get there could be littered with a lot of suffering. Economic dislocation, environmental damage, social strife. Are we okay with that? I'd say most right-accelerationists aren't rooting for suffering, they just see it as possibly unavoidable. Or they're so fixated on the long game that the short-term pain is abstract to them. It's a bit grim. For example, if nothing human makes it out as Land speculated, then who are we doing this for? That line is a conversation stopper for a lot of people, understandably. It's almost a sci-fi, or even religious way of thinking, like birthing a new form of intelligence or society that eclipses us. Some find that thrilling, others find it horrifying. I personally am not 100% on board with sacrificing humanity, haha. I just lean toward thinking that we can't easily stop this train. So better to be on it, and maybe even enjoy the ride of innovation, rather than futilely trying to stop it.
And I lean toward thinking we can at least change the train's course or build better brakes and safety mechanisms on it, rather than letting it derail us. Neither of us has a crystal clear map of the future, though. We're both extrapolating from trends and our favorite theorists.
Exactly. It might turn out that neither pure left nor pure right accelerationism is how things play out, but some mix or an entirely different dynamic. Still, it's cool to discuss and debate these things because they're not just abstract, they're about where our world is heading with AI, automation, and global capitalism all accelerating.
So if we circle back to the big question, which version of accelerationism is superior? I have to say, unsurprisingly, that I think the left-accelerationist approach is better, because it aligns acceleration with human needs and emancipation. It's more humane, and, in my view, ethically justified. But I'll concede that it's only superior if it can actually be achieved. Its success rides on political action and collective will, which is hard. The idea of using capitalism's own infrastructure to leap to a new system is inspiring, but it remains to be seen if we can pull it off.
From my side, I'll rep the right-accelerationist stance as the more realistic, if rough path, basically riding the horse that's running at full speed, that horse being capitalism. I'd argue it's superior in the sense of being aligned with how things have already been unfolding. Like, history kinda is a record of runaway economic and technological growth with humans adapting alongside it. Pushing that further and faster might lead to breakthroughs that a guided approach could miss. And frankly, the right-ACC approach doesn't require a mass movement or consensus. It's sort of happening on its own. But it comes with big risks and unknowns, I admit. It can also be pretty impersonal, even ruthless.
In the end, maybe it's not about crowning a winner. Each side has some strengths and weaknesses. Left-Accelerationism has the moral high ground of wanting tech to serve everyone and a clear idea of where we want to go, a post-capitalist egalitarian future. But it struggles with the how. Right-Accelerationism has the benefit of riding the current momentum of history and doesn't need everyone to agree since it leverages individual incentives and emergent outcomes. But it can lead to outcomes that many of us might not actually want, and it risks losing sight of humanity in the process.
Yeah, well put. I also think our views aren't entirely mutually exclusive. Sometimes I joke that maybe the superior accelerationism would be a combo, use the market's energy to get things going, but at key points, use political steering to avoid total disaster, sort of meet in the middle. Who knows if that hybrid would work, but it might be what actually happens intentionally or not. After all, even a lot of tech billionaires are now calling for things like UBI when they talk about automation, which is kinda a left ACC idea coming from very right ACC circumstances. Absolutely. Change is coming either way, so better to engage with it consciously. I respect that your camp is trying to make it a change for the better, and I hope you respect that my camp is pointing out the power of the forces at play, and maybe enjoying the thrill of it a bit.
That's true. It's an interesting time, lines are blurring in practice. Ultimately, I think we both agree on one fundamental thing: stagnation is not the answer. We want things to change and accelerate, we just care about different aspects of the ride. The worst outcome for both of us would be a society that just tries to cling to the old status quo and misses the opportunities of technology for me, or stifles the self-driving engine of progress for you. I do. I mean, I can't fully embrace your laissez-faire approach, but I get why it's compelling. There's a certain awe in watching the exponential trends and just saying, let's see how far this can go. And I appreciate that you're grappling with the hard questions it raises.
This has been a pretty balanced chat, I'd say. We've laid out our cases without, hopefully, straw-manning each other. No formal debate winner here. Just two perspectives.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. Learned a bit about how you think, and it made me reflect on my own stance too. In the grand scheme, history will be the real judge of which approach or mix proves superior. Maybe in a few decades we'll have this talk again and see which predictions came true.
Sounds good. Who knows, by then we might have AI joining our discussion as a third accelerationist perspective. Until then, we keep theorizing and, in our own ways, pushing for the future.
For sure. At least we're both on the side of the future, one way or another. Here's to acceleration, with purpose or pedal to the metal, and the interesting times ahead.